السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. ما بعد، قال الله تعالى في القرآن العظيم: قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون والذين هم للزكاة فاعلون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون. صدق الله العظيم. We've been discussing the beginning ayat of Surah Al-Mu'minun, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes many different qualities of the believers. We spoke about concentration and devotion in salah. We spoke about staying away from al-laghu, which is useless talk and talk which will not benefit you and may harm you in the hereafter. Then we spoke about zakat and giving sadaqah in the way of Allah and giving zakat for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also purifying our nafs. Today we'll talk about a very important and pertinent topic in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ. He tells us that these believers who are the inheritors of paradise, the highest level of Jannah, which is Al-Firdaus, what is their quality? وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ. They guard their private parts. They guard themselves from falling into haram in terms of adultery. وَالَّذِينَ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُم. They guard their private parts, their private organs, except from their own spouses or that which their right hands possess, meaning their slaves. So these are the two permissible means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned by which a person is فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. They are not blamed for this. Other than that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. Anyone who seeks anything beyond these two means, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ, then they are indeed the transgressors. And interestingly, many ulama from these ayat, they deduce that the sin, that masturbation is a sin and is something which is wrong and it is not permissible to do. And this is deduced by the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they protect themselves, their private parts, from everything except for their wives and their slaves. So only those two exceptions were mentioned. So that means everything besides that would be impermissible. And so from this we understand the great sin of zina and how it is something that a true believer will be completely far away from. And in another ayah in Surah Al-Furqan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is discussing the qualities of Ibadur Rahman, the true slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of the most merciful. And He says, وَلَا يَزْنُونَ. There are such people that they never commit adultery. And similarly, there comes in a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which he says, "La yazni zani wa huwa hina yazni wa huwa mu'min." That the person who commits adultery, he never does so in a state that he is a believer. Meaning that at that point, that moment in which this person is doing this hideous act, at that moment he is not a believer. Meaning, it doesn't mean that he has literally become a disbeliever outside the fold of Islam, but his iman has left him. He is not cognizant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's as if he doesn't even believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because he's committing such a great act, a terrible act. And so it is very important for us to focus on staying away from this great sin. And this is something which is becoming more and more prevalent in our society. We know that immodesty and immorality and degeneracy is something which is so common in our society now. And the vast majority of people are committing this act. Na'udhu billah. Even amongst the Muslims, we see that the vast majority are falling into this act. Whether it be the young people or even the elder generation are not safe from this. Unfortunately, many people are falling into infidelity as well. And so we have to look at the roots of the problem and fix things at the root. And the root of the very issue is laxity in interaction with the opposite gender. And I use these very vague words intentionally, that we are lax in our interactions with the opposite gender. And going back to the ayah in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Don't even come close to zina. So from this we deduce that any single thing that could possibly be a means to zina, we're supposed to leave that. So Allah doesn't just say, لَا تَزْنِ, do not commit adultery. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not even come close to zina. So that includes so many different things. And the list keeps on adding year after year as we have more and more things that are coming out, new technology, new things that are adding to the list of things which make us closer to zina. And so there are more and more things that we have to avoid in the society that we are living in. And so it is very important for us, first and foremost, to guard our gaze. The hadith mentions that النظرة سهم من سهام إبليس مسموم, that the gaze is a poisoned arrow of shaitan. As soon as you look, that poison seeps and enters into your heart, and it's very, very difficult for that poison to come out of your heart. So that is why it is very, very important for us to control our gaze and make sure we do not look at things which are not permissible. And these days are the easiest for us to fall into this act. We see that everywhere you go, people are just completely immodestly, they're dressed in the worst possible manner, especially as the days get hotter. And so we have to really act upon the commandment of Allah in which He says, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ, that they should tell the believers that they should lower their gaze. And so lowering the gaze doesn't just mean look around, keeping your eyes looking around. As soon as you see something, you look for a moment and then you look down. That'll only make things much more difficult for you, because you're going to inevitably, it's very difficult not to look again once you get that first look. To lower your gaze means to literally walk while you're looking at the ground. This is actually the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is how the Prophet ﷺ used to walk. He used to walk in a manner that he would be looking at the ground. That was the default. Yes, obviously he would have an awareness of his surroundings, but he would not be looking around, because it is very likely that you would look at haram. And that was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Imagine now, where even if you don't see a person, you'll see a billboard. Or even if you see a billboard, you'll see something on your phone, or you'll see something everywhere. It's just all around us. And so it is extremely important for us to keep our gazes lowered. Then obviously when it comes to even our devices, as I mentioned, we see that there's haram everywhere you look, right? So it's very important, first and foremost, we have ad blockers. Then when it comes to even the things that we watch, we have to be very careful. People are very lax in watching TV and watching even the news, right? We see the news anchor, the 99% of the time, what is it? It's a beautiful female who is dressed in a very beautiful manner, in the best possible manner. And so these are things we think it doesn't affect us. Oh, it's something I see every single day. But the reality is it has a great effect on the heart, and something that we have to be very careful of. And these are the steps that lead to zina. We shouldn't think that, oh, it's not a big deal, it's just the news. These are things that slowly make the hideousness of these things leave our heart, and we start thinking it's not a big deal to look at women in this manner in which they're not covered properly. And so it is very important for us to protect our gaze when we're on our phones, and obviously going much further than that, watching things which are absolutely impermissible, like pornography, which is also an epidemic. My teacher, Mufti Alimuddin, who is from Chicago, and he has a lot of experience with the community. He's always helping people out and listening to their problems and issues. So when he would teach us, he would tell us so many different stories and so many different problems, and it's very shocking and astonishing to see how prevalent this issue of addiction to pornography is in our societies. And so people might be thinking, oh, how could you talk about this from the minbar? But the reality is that we have to address it. We cannot beat around the bush anymore. We have to talk about these things with our kids, and we have to be very frank with them. And not only with our kids, but unfortunately even with our adults. Because unfortunately, this is not only a problem now amongst youth. Rather, our teacher, Mufti Saim would tell us that even to the point where you have grandfathers who literally have grandkids, yet they're committing this act, and their children are shy. They're like, look, we're like 40, 50 years old, we're married, and we have kids, and we're finding that our fathers, our mothers are falling into this filthy and indecent act. So it is extremely, extremely important for us to really keep a check on ourselves and really watch ourselves and stop these habits in their tracks. And if we need help, we can seek the advice from our respected scholars like Maulana Kashif Saab, who also has a lot of experience. But the fact is that we have to stop these things before it is too late. And then going beyond that, now the means to actual zina, that is pornography, that will lead to other things. Now the means to actual zina, it is very important for us to stop this free mixing. This is something which has become very common. You know, people, they have very lax interaction with the opposite gender, whether it is at work, whether it is at school, whether it is in their family gatherings. You know, sometimes we think, oh, it's just family, right? But the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-hamu al-maut, that the brother-in-law is death, which means that many of times infidelity and zina actually happens between the closest people to you, because those are the people you're seeing on a regular basis. So we actually need to be even more careful when it comes to those people who are directly connected and close to us. And same thing at school, people who are regularly seeing at school, people who are maybe in your study group. These are people we have to be more on guard against. We have to be very careful that we don't let our guard down. Keep things very formal with the opposite gender. The bottom line is that we have to stop being lax with the opposite gender, and we have to stop these things in their tracks before it is too late. As we mentioned, there's a quality of a true believer that they protect themselves from this haram. And someone who falls into this haram, there are many, many grave punishments that are mentioned in the ahadith with regards to a person who commits zina. And we know that even if the Sharia was being applied, we know that there's actually physical punishments that are there for people who commit zina as well. And so we have to keep all these things in mind, and we have to really fear for ourselves from falling into this despicable sin. None of us should feel safe. As Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, who was one of the greatest Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, one of the greatest ulama from amongst the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, he narrated the most ahadith out of any Sahabi. Yet towards the end of his life, what did he say? He would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika an azni aw a'mala bi kabiratin fil Islam. Oh Allah, protect me, or I seek refuge in you from committing zina or doing any sort of major sin in Islam. So his companions were shocked. They said, Ya Abu Hurairah, wa mithluka yaqulu hadha? The likes of you, Abu Hurairah, are saying this and is fearing falling into zina while you have reached such an old age, because he's not saying this at a young age. He's literally an old man and he's saying this. And on top of that, you have no more desires anymore. وَقَدْ شَافَهْتَ النَّبِيَّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. On top of this, you actually spoke to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. You had direct connection to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وَأَخَذْتَ وَبَايَعْتَهُ. You gave bay'ah to him, and you actually took ilm from him. So how could you be fearing this? And what was Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu's response? He said, وَيْحَكْ وَمَا يُؤَمِّنُنِي وَإِبْلِيسُ حَيٍّ. He said, woe to you. What could make me safe while Iblis, shaitan, is still alive? In another narration, he says, وَيُمْقَلِّبُ الْقُلُوبِ يَصْرِفُهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ. And the turner of the hearts can turn the heart any way whenever he wants. And so this is the response that we should keep in our minds, in our hearts, and realize that no matter whether we're married, whether we're unmarried, whether we're young, whether we're old, we can never ever feel safe from this sin, especially in the society we're living in. And we have to always be on guard and constantly ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for protection from this sin. And there's a dua from the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min sharri sam'i, wa min sharri basari, wa min sharri lisani, wa min sharri qalbi, wa min sharri maniyyi. Asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for protection from the evil of our hearing, what we hear, what we see, our tongues, and of our hearts, and min sharri mani, of even the fluids, basically the sperm. Even the Prophet ﷺ is telling us to seek refuge from the evil of our sperm, which is referring to falling into these haram acts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of us and grant us al-tawfiq wa akhirana alhamdulillah rabbil. I apologize for the lengthy lecture, but I felt this was a topic that was important, so that's why I went a little further. May Allah grant us all tawfiq.